Hi, I'm George McClure for ListenUp TV. We're here at our 2013 Music Matters event with John Atkinson, editor of Stereophile and world-renowned recording engineer. John, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I think it's so important for events like Music Matters to get audiophiles excited about listening to music with the highest possible quality.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I wanted to talk to you. We're very interested in presenting the best equipment for audiophiles, but I'm also interested in broadening the scope of audio's appeal to, and we'd really like to see more younger people, more women. How do you think the industry, and how do you think we as people that love music and our audiophiles can broaden the scope of the appeal?
Well, part of it is, I think, recognizing that high-end audio equipment isn't just for museum music, for classical music. That even if you take something like the Smashing Pumpkins Bullet with Butterfly Wings and play it on a high-end system, yes, it's compressed, yes, it's noisy, nevertheless, it sounds great on a really good system, much better on the sort of cheap system that a typical metalhead would be playing.
Well, I was intrigued by your presentation last night because you're really talking about the idea that the methods of recording have so much to do with the sound that we hear. So could you tell us some of the highlights of that?
Well, the presentation I was giving at this Music Matters was basically based on something which, so how do you judge the sound of audio equipment? And okay, you play recordings, but let's say you put on a recording and the stereo imaging is kind of woozy and fuzzy. You don't know if that's the equipment doing that, or if that's what's on the recording. And one of the recordings I played, which was of a piano, recorded in such a way that actually the stereo imaging was very poor. So if you just used that recording to make a judgment, you'd be wrong, and said, well, these speakers don't do good imaging, you'd be wrong. So my advice to, to people who are coming to the event is, don't just listen to one recording or two recordings, listen to all your recordings. And listen for how different they sound, because it's unlikely that any one recording, that recording engineers all have made the same mistake or decided to make the same character apparent in their recordings. So, listen to all your recordings, listen to an audiophile approved recording like Diana Krall live in Paris, and listen to the Smashing Pumpkins. Listen to the music which turns you on as a listener, and the better it sounds, the more different every one of those recordings sounds, then you have an idea of how good the system is performing, how neutral the components are.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I was intrigued by what you had to say about, I think all of our manufacturers talk about trying to get at the musical truth, as if they were taking a photograph of a piece of music. And you were talking about the recording engineer is really kind of doing a painting, and there's a lot of subjective judgments that come in.
Exactly the point. That recordings, everyone says, well, they're the absolute sound, they're a record, a document of a real event. And the answer is not at all. Every recording is a creative, is the result of creative work on the part of many people, the engineers, the producers, not just the musicians. It's you could say it's artifice in the service of art. So you end up with this thing, this record, this CD, this LP, and you play it, and you're not being presented with a photograph of something that happened. You're being presented something that is more like a painting. It is an impression of what happened. And the skill of the producer and the engineer and the musicians is to persuade you that you're in the presence of a musical performance, even though that performance may never have happened in real life. I mean, all recordings now are made in, one musician is playing in this studio, sends the files over to another studio, they overdub something else, and there's no real event anymore. And even in classical music, if you were to play a documentary recording of a classical concert, people would say, oh, I don't like that. That sounds too thin. Oh, it doesn't sound warm and enveloping like it does in the concert hall, partly because you're only playing back in two channels, and partly because you have to tell the truth in a recording, you mustn't be afraid to exaggerate a little. The goal is for people to enjoy the recordings, and if you can make them enjoy it more by making it sound more like what you as the engineer want to sound rather than a document of reality, then that's what you do.
Well, I think you made the point last night too that we're all creating this in our own brains anyway. And we're trying to get this supposedly objective truth, but it's being created by this sort of illusions anyway.
Well, it is all illusion. I mean, the point I was making last night is that, you play on a recording, and there between and behind the loudspeakers appears a band or an orchestra or an opera cast. And of course, it's all an illusion, but none of that is real. All you have is a pair of loudspeakers, each producing sound, and your brain takes the information received by your ears and reconstructs an internal model of, well, that must have been what it was like. I must have been in the studio where Fleetwood Mac recorded Rumours, and there's Stevie Nicks there, and there's Christine Perfect there, and John McVie there, but it's all an illusion. And so as I was saying, anything the engineer and producer can do to make that illusion stronger, make you have to do less work in order to recreate those internal models, is justifiable.
Well, and you also, though, on a scientific side, you have obviously developed a set of very specific criteria you use in your Stereophile reviews to try to measure the objective reality of how a piece of equipment is doing at really recreating those recordings.
Yes, with a huge sort of shortcut, which is what I can do is I can measure the sound coming out of these speakers, I can measure the electrical signal coming out of that amplifier, and I can at least assess how much those signals are processed by the product. In other words, is the product doing something wrong? Is it adding distortion? Is it doing something wrong? However, one thing that I think doesn't get talked about much is that all the measurements that people like me do in magazines and manufacturers do in their laboratories, we always do it in mono. We measure one speaker at a time, but we always listen in stereo to two speakers. And one of the things that, is very difficult to measure is the effect of aberrations that the speaker is doing in mono. How would it affect what happens in stereo? And I've written a little about this in the magazine. For example, if you have a speaker with a very lively cabinet, you knock it and it goes sort of bonk. If you play music, now both those speaker cabinets there are putting out the music, and you're constructing your internal images as you want. Nevertheless, the speakers are also going bonk, 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 every musical transient. So if you think about it, the music is coming from there, but the speakers on the edges are doing something wrong. So the actual thing they're doing wrong, the cabinet singing, as it were, with the music, is coming from a different place in space to where the music is coming from, which makes it very much more audible. It's maybe low level, but it's not coming from there where Diana Krall is coming from. It's coming from over there where there actually isn't anything in the mix. And so you become more aware of it than you otherwise would be the case.
Can you tell us some of the recordings that you think are sort of reference recordings that can allow people, that are good demonstration material for people to test some of their equipment?
For classical, the reference recordings done by Professor Keith Johnson are superb in terms of capturing the flow, the dynamics, the full range of sound produced by an orchestra. But he doesn't use a purist mic technique. He does what needs to be done to get the message across. Right now, actually triggered by Super Audio CD, I think it's a golden age of classical recording. Labels like Channel Classics in Holland are producing wonderful sounding recordings. The San Francisco Symphony are doing have done a cycle of Mahler symphonies on their own label, releasing on SACD, also on LP, and now apparently as downloads.
How about any pop recordings off the top of your head?
Well, maybe because I'm an old fart, I think that things like Led Zeppelin recordings from the early 70s were just about as good as it could get in terms of capturing the sound of a rock band at its best without messing up the sound. I give you an example. Led Zeppelin just recently released their Ahmet Ertegun tribute concert from 2007 on CD and as high-res files. And I compared it with How the West Was Won, which was their live concerts from California they did in 1973, I think it was. And there's no comparison. The modern sound is just sort of gritty and grainy and the bass drum is just a big blur. You go back 30 years, 35 years, no, 40 years, and John Bonham's drums sound like drums, like live rock drums should. And I think it's a sad thing right now that with rock recording, there's so much technology used to mess up the sound. For example, on that Led Zeppelin Celebration album, there was an article in Sound on Sound, the professional magazine, in January, and the mixing engineer was saying, "Oh yes, I used a sub-bass synthesizer on the kick drum because I didn't think it sounded powerful enough." And so instead of hearing the pure sound of a rock kick drum, which is a punchy sound, you get this bleh sound. So rock, I don't know. As I said, Smashing Pumpkins surprised me by being well recorded.
Well, they seem to be compressing the dynamic range in a lot of these new recordings.
They
also
are. But you can, I think, if you're compressing, say, the guitar, but not the overall track, that's acceptable. You're using a tool in the production. You're not just squeezing the life out of the music just to make it sound loud. I mean, and there are, things like the late Phil Ramone engineered a beautiful recording by Shelby Lynn a few years back, where she did all Dusty Springfield songs, and that is just
a great record. Yeah,
it's good. It's got space. It's open. It's got dynamics. I mean, Shelby Lynn does a really good job of singing those classic songs. As I, we're at a moment we're in the middle of the end, I hope, of what has been called the Loudness Wars, where record companies compress their music to make it sound louder than what's before and after it on the radio. And the result is the music gets squashed out of existence. I mean, you think about it, something like Red Hot Chili Peppers' Californication. That track has a dynamic range of 5 dB. A sine wave is the most compression you can get, has a dynamic range of, I think, 4 dB. So in other words, a sine wave by definition carries no musical information. So by using extreme compression on their recordings just to make them sound loud, then record companies are destroying the music they want us to buy. And, if you take one of those recordings and turn it down so that the average level is the same as a good recording like the Shelby Lynn I mentioned, it doesn't sound loud anymore. It just sounds wimpy because they've squashed out all the dynamic transients and the life. So there is a move right now amongst mastering engineers and amongst recording engineers to try to persuade record companies to produce not more natural sounding recordings, because I said that's an illusion, but recordings which still have light and shade. And interestingly, an ally in this is Apple. Because Apple, with their loudness normalization, when you loudness normalize drastically compressed cuts like the Red Hot Chili Peppers, now they don't sound loud anymore. They just sound weak and wimpy. So with everybody normalizing their track loudnesses to play on their iPods, now they've taken away the incentive for the record companies to overcompress their music. So actually the future looks a bit brighter than it did 10 years ago.
Well, we're glad to hear that. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, John. We appreciate it. Once again, John Atkinson, Stereophile editor and world-renowned recording engineer. And this is George McClure for ListenUp TV.